Looking at this, what do we call this top portion right here? Iliac crest. What do we call the tailbone? Coccyx. What do we call this? Sacrum. We're looking at the back because of this vertical median sacral crest. So these openings we call the posterior sacral foramina. Shoulder blade, you can see here's the spine of the scapula. Then it becomes the acromion process. Below the spine of the scapula, you have the infraspinous fossa. Above the spine of the scapula, you can see we have the supraspinous fossa. What were these called that are projecting backwards? Part of the thoracic spine, it's the spinous process. Front of the spine, what do we call this, which is real? The body of the vertebrae. Looking at this, what do we have here? This is the nasal cavity. Here's the nasal cavity. This is the outer part of the nasal cavity, which you can find the concha or the concha. So we have this top one, we call the superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and the inferior nasal concha or concha. If you look at this on the side, this one, you can identify the structure that's sitting inside the nasal cavity. We call the nasal septum. We have the septal cartilage, which is light blue. You have the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and then you have the vomer bone. Looking at, let's go over to this next. What do we call this bone? Upper or lower jaw? Lower jaw, we call the maxilla or mandible. This is your mandible. What you can see, we have the angle of the mandible and then the body of the mandible. When looking at the real skull, what you can see, let's actually find a better one. It's not broken. This one is the best. You have the sella turcica. And then right in front of the sella turcica, you have these openings we call the what? The optic foramen, the optic canals. Looking at the cast of the skull, sella turcica, right in front is the foramen the optic canals. Right here, you can see this opening, oval shaped, that's the foramen ovale. Looking a little bit laterally, you have the foramen spinosum. Then what do we call this large opening? The foramen magnum. Looking at the bottom portion, this is your mastoid process. And then what do we call this sharp one? That's your sharp styloid process. So mastoid process, styloid process on this side, mastoid process, and then the styloid process. When looking at this, what bone is this right here? You can see we have a vertical projection going up. What do we call this vertical projection that starts with a D? Dens, we call the dens part of C1 or C2? C2 called the atlas or axis? Axis. This one right here, what you can see we lack the dens going up. Is that atlas or axis right here? That's going to be your atlas, also known as C1. If you see openings in the transverse process, we call the transverse foramen. Does that belong to cervical, thoracic, or lumbar spine when you see these openings? On this side, cervical. That cervical spine. When you look at, let's do this one versus this one. So you can see we don't have the openings in the transverse process. So when you look at this, the spinous process is long, projecting downwards. Does that belong to the transverse the thoracic spine or lumbar spine? Thoracic spine. When you look at the lumbar spine, what does that belong? What you can see is the spinous process is more boxy in nature. So the thoracic spine, elongated spinous process. With the lumbar spine, the spinous process is more boxy in nature. Last couple of things, when you look at the pediatric skull, what do we call this diamond-shaped pink structure? That's called the frontal fontanelle. When going back to the actual sutures. What suture separated the frontal bone from the two parietal bones? So what was the suture called? Coronal suture. What suture separated the left parietal from the right parietal? Sagittal suture. And then what suture separated the two parietals from the occipital bone? Start with an L, that's the lambdoid suture. When you look at the cheekbone, what was that called? Zygomatic arch, zygomatic bone. The ear canal we call the external auditory canal. Right by it, here's the temporal bone, which, what do we call this suture that separates temporal bone from the parietal bone? That's called the square-shaped squamous suture. Looking at this, just random bone, what part of the spine does that belong to?
Thoracic.
Thoracic, because of that elongated spinous process. When you look at this one, what does this belong to? Cervical, specifically C1 or C2, atlas or axis? That's going to be your first one. C1 we call the atlas. Lacking that dense going up. What else? What's this called? Which has someone's hair on it from other class. Coccyx, that's your tailbone. With that. Let's see what else. Let's look at the hand one more time. So thumb, pinky, digit 1, digit 5, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, rectangular capitate, and the hamate, because you have that hook. Which one was this again? That was your distal, middle, or proximal phalanx. That's going to be your proximal phalanx. So here's your distal phalanx, then there's your proximal phalanx. This bone, towards the thumb side, we call the radius. Towards the pinky side, what do we call that? The ulna. And that's it.